In Denver's upscale Sunset Manor, a 62-year-old retired food safety inspector was about to face the cruelest dinner service imaginable. What started as routine evening dining took a shocking turn when she recognized dog food on her plate. Sylvia Williams wasn't your typical assisted living resident. For 35 years, she had mastered food safety regulations, known for shutting down violating restaurants with surgical precision. When arrogant facility manager Tyler Brennan filmed residents eating pet food as a prank, Sylvia methodically documented every violation while maintaining perfect composure. What began as humiliating entertainment became strategic annihilation. Denver's elder care industry would never underestimate grandmothers again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sylvia Williams had lived in Sunset Manor for exactly 3 weeks, 2 days, and 17 hours when they served her dog food for dinner. She knew it was dog food the moment the spoon touched her lips. 35 years as a Colorado food safety inspector had given her an encyclopedic knowledge of textures, preservatives, and the particular way protein breaks down under industrial processing. The metallic aftertaste of rendered meat byproducts, the telltale grittiness of bone meal, the unmistakable chemical signature of sodium tripole phosphate, a preservative common in pet food but regulated differently in human consumption. The dining room at Sunset Manor buzzed with its usual evening energy. Residents sat at round tables draped in burgundy cloth, the kind of forced elegance that screamed, "We cost more than the competition." Crystal water glasses caught the soft lighting from ornate chandeliers. Everything designed to whisper luxury and care to visiting family members who needed to justify the monthly bills. Sylvia sat at her usual table by the window, where she could observe the kitchen doors and monitor the staff's movements. Old habits. Eleanor Ellie Davis, her tablemate and the closest thing she had to a friend in this place, was delicately pushing the mystery meat around her plate with a troubled expression. "Something's not right about this," Ellie murmured, her voice carrying the educated cadence of her 30 years teaching high school English. "The texture is odd." Across the dining room, Harold Prentice had already finished his portion and was asking for seconds. Sweet Harold, whose diabetes medication had slowly stolen his sense of taste over the past decade. At the table near the fireplace, Margaret Chen sat staring at her plate with the confused expression that had become more common since her mini-stroke. She'd taken 3 tentative bites and stopped, her fork suspended mid-air. Sylvia's trained eye swept the room, cataloging reactions. About half the residents were eating without complaint, those with compromised senses of taste or smell, those too polite to cause a scene, those who'd learned that complaining in institutional settings rarely improved their circumstances. The other half showed varying degrees of confusion or distaste. But it was the staff that confirmed her suspicions. Tyler Brennan stood near the kitchen doors, his 28-year-old face animated with barely contained amusement. The operations manager had the kind of aggressive handsomeness that had probably served him well in college. All sharp jawlines and expensive haircuts, with eyes that never quite held the warmth his smile suggested. He whispered something to Linda Stevens, the head of dining services, whose 45-year-old face had gone pale with what looked like mortification. Linda shook her head vigorously, backing away from Tyler with her hands raised in a gesture that screamed reluctance. But Tyler pulled out his phone, angling it toward the dining room with the practiced ease of someone who lived his life through social media metrics. Sylvia's internal temperature dropped about 10 degrees. She set down her spoon with deliberate precision, the soft clink against the china plate somehow carrying more menace than if she'd slammed it down. Ellie noticed immediately. "Sylvia, what is it?" "Watch the young man by the kitchen," Sylvia said quietly, her voice carrying the measured calm she'd perfected during decades of confronting restaurant owners about health violations. "Notice anything about his behavior?" Ellie followed her gaze. Tyler had his phone out now, clearly recording. His expression held the particular brand of cruel anticipation that belonged to someone about to pull off what they considered a clever prank. "He's filming us," Ellie whispered, her teacher's instincts recognizing predatory behavior when she saw it. Among other things. Sylvia folded her napkin with geometric precision and placed it beside her plate. "Tell me, Ellie, in your years of teaching, did you ever encounter the type of student who tortured small animals for amusement?" Before Ellie could answer, Tyler stepped forward, his voice carrying across the dining room with the practiced projection of someone used to commanding attention. "Good evening, residents!" His tone dripped with false cheer. "I hope everyone's enjoying tonight's special dinner. We've been trying some innovative approaches to our meal planning, and tonight was what you might call a taste test." Sylvia felt her jaw tighten. Around the room, conversations stopped. Residents looked up from their plates with varying degrees of confusion and growing unease. Tyler continued, his phone still recording. "The kitchen staff and I were curious whether our discerning residents would notice if we served them something a little different. Something that technically meets all nutritional requirements but costs significantly less than our usual fare." Margaret Chen's fork clattered to her plate. Harold Prentice looked around the room with dawning comprehension. At the table near the piano, Robert Martinez, a retired engineer with Parkinson's, whose hands shook but whose mind remained razor-sharp, slowly pushed his plate away. "What we served tonight," Tyler said, his grin widening as his phone captured the growing distress around the room, "was premium dog food. Beef and barley, grain-free, organic, better than what most of you probably fed your pets. And honestly, most of you didn't even notice." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Margaret Chen made a small, distressed sound and pressed her napkin to her mouth. Harold's face flushed red with humiliation. Ellie gripped Sylvia's wrist under the table, her fingers trembling with outrage. But Sylvia remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. Years of dealing with the worst that human nature could offer in the food service industry had taught her the value of controlling her reactions. Let them see rage, and they'd dismiss her as an hysterical old woman. Let them see cold calculation, and they might actually pay attention. "The point," Tyler continued, clearly delighted with the effect his revelation was having, "is that expectations are everything. You expected high-quality food, so that's what you tasted. It's a fascinating psychological experiment, really. And hey, you all got extra protein tonight." Someone at the back of the room started crying. Sylvia couldn't see who, but the sound of soft sobs began to permeate the horrified silence. Tyler's grin faltered slightly, as if he hadn't expected quite this level of distress, but he kept filming. Now, he said, his tone shifting to mock reassurance. "No one's been harmed. If anything, you should be impressed with the kitchen's presentation skills. Linda really outdid herself, making it look like real human food." Linda Stevens stood frozen by the kitchen doors, her face a mask of shame and horror. Her eyes met Sylvia's across the room, and in that moment, Sylvia saw everything she needed to know. Linda hadn't wanted to do this. Linda had been pressured, probably threatened with her job if she refused. Linda was trapped between feeding her own family and protecting the dignity of the residents in her care. Tyler's phone continued to record as residents began to react. Some sat in stunned silence. Others began to express their outrage in quavering voices that Tyler clearly found amusing rather than concerning. Harold pushed back from his table and left the dining room without a word, his dignity intact but his shoulders bowed with humiliation. "I think we've learned something valuable here tonight," Tyler said, still addressing his phone as much as the room. "About assumptions, about expectations, and about how easy it is to fool people when they're not paying attention." That's when Sylvia spoke. Her voice cut through the dining room with the authority of someone who'd spent decades shutting down restaurants and hauling food service managers before regulatory boards. It wasn't loud, but it carried in a way that made every conversation stop and every head turn. "Mr. Brennan." Tyler's phone wavered slightly as he looked at her. Something in her tone, perhaps, or the way she sat perfectly straight in her chair, made his smirk falter. "I have a question for you," Sylvia continued, her words measured and precise. "In your extensive research into the nutritional content of premium dog food, Did you happen to investigate the regulatory differences between pet food manufacturing and human food production? Tyler's expression shifted slightly, uncertainty creeping in. What do you mean? Sylvia said, rising from her chair with the deliberate grace of someone who'd learned not to show weakness even when surrounded by predators. That dog food is manufactured under entirely different FDA guidelines than human food. Different facilities, different oversight, different contamination protocols. The sodium levels alone exceed recommended daily allowances for seniors by approximately 300%. The room had gone completely silent now. Even the soft crying had stopped as everyone, residents and staff alike, focused on Sylvia's words. More importantly, she continued, her voice taking on the lecturing tone she'd perfected during thousands of regulatory presentations. Serving non-human food products to paying residents of a licensed care facility violates approximately 17 state health codes, constitutes fraud under Colorado consumer protection laws, and likely violates the terms of your facility's insurance coverage. Tyler's phone was no longer recording. His face had gone from amused to uncertain to something approaching worried. Look, it was just a prank. No one was actually hurt. No one was hurt, Sylvia repeated, her tone suggesting she found that assertion debatable. An interesting defense. Tell me, Mr. Brennan, do you plan to include that reasoning in your incident report to the Colorado Department of Health? Or will you be filing that report at all? The young man's mouth opened and closed without sound. Around the room, residents were beginning to sit up straighter, to pay attention in a way they hadn't in weeks. Even Linda Stevens had straightened, her eyes fixed on Sylvia, with something approaching hope. Sylvia picked up her purse with deliberate care and walked toward the dining room exit. As she passed Tyler, she paused and looked up at him with the kind of smile that had once made restaurant owners break out in cold sweats. Premium dog food, she said conversationally. Beef and barley, organic, grain-free. That would be the Diamond Naturals line, I believe, based on the texture and preservative profile. Approximately $4 per pound at retail. I'm curious what you charged the facility's food budget for tonight's experiment. Tyler's face had gone pale. Sylvia's smile widened slightly. Don't worry, Mr. Brennan. I'm sure it's all properly documented in your procurement records. After all, a facility of this caliber would never engage in financial irregularities along with its culinary adventures. She walked out of the dining room with her head high, leaving behind a silence that felt entirely different from the defeated quiet that had followed Tyler's cruel revelation. This silence hummed with possibility, with the sense that something had shifted in the balance of power. In her room, Sylvia sat down at her small desk and opened her laptop. Her fingers, steady despite her 62 years, began to type. First, a detailed incident report with precise timestamps and specific regulatory violations. Then, a list of witnesses and their reactions. Finally, a preliminary search of Colorado eldercare regulations and the contact information for the state licensing board. Tyler Brennan thought he'd staged a clever prank, a bit of cruel entertainment at the expense of people he viewed as powerless and forgotten. What he'd actually done was hand a 35-year veteran of food safety enforcement everything she needed to destroy him. Sylvia saved her documents and closed the laptop. Through her window, Denver's lights twinkled in the distance, the city where she'd spent decades protecting people from exactly this kind of abuse. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of reminding young Mr. Brennan that underestimating the elderly was not just cruel, it was strategically inadvisable. The taste of dog food still lingered on her tongue, metallic and degrading, but underneath it, Sylvia tasted something else entirely, the sweet anticipation of justice served cold. Tyler Brennan had no idea what he'd just awakened, but he was about to learn that some grandmothers had sharper teeth than others, and that the last laugh often belonged to those who'd been underestimated their entire lives. The hunt was on. Marcus's hand moved instinctively to the small digital thermometer clipped to her keychain as she walked the corridors of Sunset Manor the next morning. Old habits died hard, and Sylvia Williams had built her career on the foundation that temperature readings often revealed the difference between compliance and catastrophe. The facility's morning routine buzzed around her with practiced efficiency, But Sylvia's trained eye saw details that other residents missed. Staff members moved with the hurried pace of people cutting corners. Medication carts rattled with loose wheels that suggested deferred maintenance. Even the hallway carpeting showed wear patterns that indicated cleaning schedules had been reduced. She'd barely slept. The metallic taste of dog food still lingered despite aggressive toothbrushing. But more than physical revulsion, it was the systematic nature of Tyler's cruelty that kept her mind racing. This hadn't been spontaneous. The preparation, the filming, the casual dismissal of residents' dignity all pointed to something deeper. 35 years of investigation had taught her that food safety violations were rarely isolated incidents. Where you found one problem, you found 10 others hiding beneath the surface. The dining room doors swung open as breakfast service began. Sylvia positioned herself strategically, pulling out her phone to activate the voice memo app she'd used for field inspections. Day 1. Post-incident documentation, she murmured quietly. Observing breakfast service protocols. Time: 7:15 a.m. Linda Stevens emerged from the kitchen, carrying scrambled eggs, her movements more hurried than usual. The woman looked like she'd slept as poorly as Sylvia had. Dark circles beneath carefully applied concealer, trembling hands as she arranged place settings. When Linda approached their table, Sylvia interrupted Ellie's weather commentary. "Linda, might I have a word with you, privately?" "Of course, Mrs. Williams. Let me just finish." "Now would be better," Sylvia said, her tone carrying the authority that had once shut down restaurants across Colorado. At the coffee station, Sylvia poured institutional-grade coffee and studied the kitchen through the service window. Hand-washing stations positioned incorrectly. Temperature logs that appeared to be filled out in identical handwriting. Equipment scattered, rather than systematically arranged. Each detail screamed corner cutting disguised by surface presentation. Linda approached with cautious steps. "How long has Tyler been cutting food costs?" Sylvia asked directly. Linda's composure cracked. Sylvia, I'm not sure what you mean." "Linda." Sylvia's tone softened marginally. "I spent 3 decades investigating food service operations. The question isn't whether it's happening. It's how bad it's gotten and whether you're going to help me document it." "I have 2 teenagers," Linda whispered, glancing toward the kitchen. "College applications, medical bills. I can't afford to lose this job." Quote, "And I can't afford to sit quietly while residents are abused," Sylvia replied. "But I'm not asking you to sacrifice your livelihood. I'm asking you to help me build a case that protects everyone." Linda checked for eavesdroppers. The dog food wasn't his first experiment. Last month, expired meat we'd marked for disposal. Before that, diluting milk with water. He makes me sign procurement orders for accountability. But really, it's so he can claim innocence if questioned. Sylvia cataloged federal violations internally. Documentation? I kept copies. Insurance, I guess. "Things have already gone wrong," Sylvia said gently. "The question is whether we let them get worse." Tyler's arrival interrupted their conversation. His usual swagger seemed forced. Eyes sweeping the room nervously before focusing on their corner discussion with something approaching alarm. "Good morning, ladies," Tyler said, approaching with forced cheerfulness. "I hope everyone's feeling better after last night's little misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Sylvia repeated, finding the word choice fascinating. "You know how it is with seniors. Sometimes things get blown out of proportion. Memory issues. Confusion about what actually happened versus what people think they remember." Sylvia moved forward, closing distance until she had to look up to meet his eyes. "My memory is quite clear, Mr. Brennan. As is my understanding of Colorado food safety regulations, federal elder care standards, and the legal definition of institutional abuse. Would you like me to refresh your memory?" Tyler's facade flickered. "Why don't we discuss this in my office? Privately? I prefer public discussions. Transparency in institutional management. Accountability to residents who pay for your services." Around them, other residents noticed the exchange. Harold Prentice observed from the coffee line with something approaching hope. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Tyler's jaw tightened. "If you have concerns, I encourage you to discuss them with our customer service department. They're trained to handle resident complaints appropriately." "I'm sure they are," Sylvia said pleasantly. "I'm also sure the Colorado Department of Health has trained inspectors to handle institutional violations appropriately. It's really a question of which process would be more educational." Tyler's face went pale. He turned and walked quickly toward administrative offices. Confident stride replaced by something much less assured. Linda stared after him. "You realize he's going to retaliate?" "I'm counting on it," Sylvia replied calmly. Men like Tyler always overplay their hand when threatened. It's one of their most predictable weaknesses. After breakfast, Sylvia took what appeared to be a casual facility stroll. In reality, she conducted systematic assessment with the thoroughness that had made her legendary among restaurant owners. Kitchen glimpses revealed insufficient raw-cooked food separation, cleaning supplies stored too close to prep surfaces, temperature logs filled out retroactively. Each violation would be minor alone. Together they painted systematic neglect disguised by presentation designed to fool casual observers. Her phone buzzed with an unknown number. "Stop causing trouble or you'll find yourself moved to a less accommodating facility. Some residents aren't capable of independent living." Sylvia screenshot the message immediately, saving it to a folder titled Documentation TB Harassment. Tyler had just made his first major tactical error. Threatening a former state regulatory official via text wasn't just stupid, it was criminal. In her room, she opened her laptop and began typing. First, a detailed response copying facility corporate offices and state licensing boards. Then formal complaint letters outlining specific violations and requesting immediate inspection. Finally, she researched Denver attorneys specializing in elder law and institutional abuse. Tyler thought he was playing with house rules favoring him. He didn't understand that Sylvia had just changed the game entirely. In her version, the house always lost. Sylvia's hand trembled slightly as she dialed the number for Hartwell and Associates. 2 weeks of methodical investigation had yielded a manila folder thick with evidence. But she knew documentation meant nothing without proper legal representation. She'd researched every elder law attorney in Denver, cross-referencing their case histories, success rates, and, most importantly, their willingness to take on institutional abuse cases. Benjamin Hartwell's name had appeared repeatedly in her research. Public interest law, specializing in elder rights, recent victories against nursing home chains. His website photo showed a serious-looking man in his late 30s with tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too much of what people were capable of doing to the vulnerable. Hartwell and Associates, this is Ben. His voice carried the distracted tone of someone juggling too many cases. "Mr. Hartwell, my name is Sylvia Williams. I need to discuss a potential elder abuse case involving systematic violations at an assisted living facility." She heard papers shuffling on his end. "Ma'am, I appreciate you calling, but I should mention up front that my caseload is pretty full right now. Can you give me a brief overview of your situation?" The dismissive edge in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. "Another complaining senior," his tone suggested. "Probably upset about lukewarm soup or a favorite chair being moved." "They served us dog food," Sylvia said simply. "Intentionally, as entertainment." The paper shuffling stopped. "I'm sorry, what?" "Purina dog chow, to be specific. The operations manager filmed our reactions for social media content." "But that's just the beginning." Sylvia opened her folder, pages rustling. "I have documented evidence of expired food products, temperature violations in food storage, falsified health inspection records, and financial irregularities in meal service billing." "Ma'am, these are serious allegations. Are you saying you have actual documentation?" "I'm saying I have a career's worth of experience in food safety inspection and 2 weeks of methodical evidence gathering. I know the difference between legitimate complaints and actionable violations, Mr. Hartwell. The question is whether you're interested in representing someone who can actually prove her case." Ben's tone shifted perceptibly. "Could you come in this afternoon? I'd like to see what you've collected." An hour later, Sylvia sat across from Ben Hartwell in his cramped downtown office, watching his expression change as he reviewed her evidence. She'd organized everything chronologically, cross-referenced by violation type, with photographs, temperature logs, and detailed notes written in her precise inspector's handwriting. "This is..." Ben looked up from the folder, his tired eyes now sharp with attention. "Ms. Williams, this is incredibly thorough. You documented temperature readings? Every day for 2 weeks. The walk-in cooler runs consistently at 45 degrees. Health code requires 38 or below." Sylvia pointed to her temperature log. "I also photographed expired dairy products still being used in meal preparation, and documented 3 separate instances of cross-contamination between raw and cooked foods." Ben flipped through photographs showing moldy cheese being scraped clean, chicken stored above ready-to-eat salads, and thermometer readings that would have shut down any restaurant in the city. "How did you get access to the kitchen?" "I volunteer for meal service cleanup." Amazing what people don't notice about a helpful old lady with a dish towel. Sylvia's smile was sharp. "Tyler Brennan thinks I'm just another confused senior complaining about the food. He has no idea I spent 35 years shutting down establishments for exactly these violations." 35 years? Ben leaned back in his chair, reassessing. "You were a health inspector?" "Senior inspector for the Colorado Department of Health. Retired 3 years ago with commendations for thoroughness and successful prosecution support." Sylvia's voice carried quiet pride. "I know how these cases work, Mr. Hartwell. I know what evidence holds up in court and what doesn't." Ben was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "Can I ask why you chose assisted living? You seem more than capable of independent living." "Convenience. After my heart attack, Bobby, my nephew, insisted I needed somewhere with medical support available. Sunset Manor had excellent reviews, claimed to provide quality care." Her voice hardened. "I'm learning that there's often a significant gap between marketing promises and actual practice. Have you spoken to other residents about joining a potential lawsuit?" Sylvia's expression grew troubled. "That's been challenging. Most are afraid. Tyler has made it clear that, quote, difficult residents might find their living situations becoming uncomfortable. Mrs. Henderson was threatened with eviction after she complained about food quality last week. Intimidation of witnesses is a serious charge." Ben made notes on his legal pad. "What about staff? Any potential allies?" "Linda Stevens, the head of dining services. She's been there 5 years, knows exactly what's happening, but she's terrified of losing her job. Single mother, 2 teenagers. Tyler has her convinced that speaking out would mean financial ruin." Ben nodded thoughtfully. "We'll need her testimony to make this case stick, and we'll need to document the intimidation tactics." He looked up at Sylvia. "This is going to be a fight, Ms. Williams. Tyler's going to try to paint you as a vindictive resident with dementia, or some other convenient explanation for why your complaints shouldn't be taken seriously. Let him try." Sylvia's voice carried the steel that had made restaurant managers nervous for decades. "I've been underestimated before. It rarely works out well for the people doing the underestimating." Ben smiled for the first time since she'd entered his office. "You know, I have to admit something. When you first called, I assumed this would be another case of miscommunication or unrealistic expectations. I get a lot of calls from family members who don't understand that institutional food service isn't like home cooking. And now? Now I'm thinking Tyler Brennan has no idea what he's up against." Ben closed the folder. "I'll take your case, Ms. Williams, pro bono if necessary. But I should warn you, my usual approach is to seek settlement rather than go to trial. It's faster, less traumatic for elderly clients." Sylvia shook her head firmly. "No settlements. No confidentiality agreements. This isn't about money, Mr. Hartwell. This is about making sure Tyler Brennan and people like him understand that elder abuse has consequences. Real consequences." Ben studied her face, seeing something that reminded him uncomfortably of his own grandmother, the same fierce determination that had made her a force to be reckoned with until the day she died in a nursing home that had slowly stripped away her dignity. "All right then," he said quietly. "No settlements. We go to trial, we win, and we make sure this story gets told properly." He extended his hand. "Welcome to the fight, Ms. Williams." Quote. As Sylvia shook his hand, she felt something she hadn't experienced since the night of the dog food incident. Hope. Not just hope for justice, but hope that she wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. Tyler Brennan thought he held all the power in this situation. He was about to learn the difference between authority and competence, between intimidation and actual strength. The war was just beginning. Ben's handshake still lingered in Sylvia's memory as she made her way through Sunset Manor's common area the next morning, her folder of evidence safely locked in her room. The partnership felt solid, professional, a validation she hadn't realized she'd been craving. But now came the harder part, convincing her fellow residents that they had both the power and the right to fight back. She found Mrs. Henderson in the sunroom, knitting with the focused intensity of someone trying to forget an unpleasant experience. The 74-year-old had been Tyler's most vocal critic after the dog food incident, until he'd made his intimidation tactics crystal clear. "Margaret." Sylvia settled into the adjacent chair, noting how the other woman's shoulders tensed at her approach. "How are you feeling today?" "Fine, fine." Mrs. Henderson's needles clicked rapidly, not looking up from her work. "Just trying to stay out of trouble, you know." "About the other night." "I don't want to talk about that." The clicking intensified. "It's over, done with. No point dwelling on unpleasantness." Sylvia recognized the fear beneath the dismissal. She'd seen it countless times in her inspection career. Witnesses who knew they'd seen violations but were terrified of the consequences of speaking up. "Margaret, I understand you're scared. But what Tyler did..." He apologized. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried a brittle edge. "Said it was just a joke that went too far. These young people, they don't always think things through." "Did he apologize before or after he threatened to have you evicted?" The knitting needles stopped. Mrs. Henderson's hands trembled slightly as she finally met Sylvia's eyes. "You heard about that? Word travels fast in a place like this." Sylvia leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Margaret, I'm working with a lawyer, a good one. Tyler can't legally evict you for complaining about legitimate problems." "Can't he?" Mrs. Henderson's laugh was bitter. "My lease agreement has a clause about, quote, maintaining facility harmony. Tyler says residents who create, quote, disruption can be asked to leave with 30 days' notice. Where am I supposed to go with 30 days' notice? My Social Security barely covers this place as it is." Sylvia felt a cold anger settling in her chest. Tyler wasn't just abusing residents. He was using their financial vulnerability as a weapon to ensure their silence. Her conversation with Mr. Costa an hour later revealed the same pattern. The retired mechanic, who'd shown spark during the dog food incident, now seemed deflated and resigned. "Look, Sylvia, I appreciate what you're trying to do," he said, his voice barely above a whisper as they sat in the facility's small library. "But I can't afford to make waves. My daughter put me here after my stroke, and she's already struggling with the payments. If they kick me out..." "They can't just kick you out for complaining about legitimate safety violations." "Can't they?" Mr. Costa's eyes were haunted. "You think Tyler gives a damn about what's legal? He's got lawyers, too. Probably better ones than whatever public defender you found." The pattern continued through the afternoon. Resident after resident, all too frightened to speak up, all convinced that Tyler held absolute power over their lives. By evening, Sylvia felt the weight of their collective fear pressing down on her shoulders. She was reviewing her notes in her room when a soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Linda Stevens stood in the doorway, looking nervous and exhausted. "Ms. Williams? Could I speak with you privately?" "Of course, come in." Sylvia gestured to the small sitting area by her window. Linda closed the door behind her and remained standing, her hands twisting together. "I heard you've been talking to residents about what happened at dinner the other night." "I have." "You're wasting your time." Linda's voice was flat, defeated. "They're too scared to help you. And honestly, they should be. Tyler doesn't make idle threats." "Then help me understand what I'm dealing with." Sylvia studied the younger woman's face. "You've been here 5 years, Linda. You know what's really going on." Linda sank into the chair across from Sylvia, suddenly looking older than her 45 years. "You have no idea how bad it's gotten since Tyler took over 8 months ago. The corners he's cutting, the money he's skimming. Tell me, the meal budget has been cut by 60%. 60%, Ms. Williams. We're supposed to provide nutritious meals for elderly residents, and he's got us buying expired meat from discount suppliers, watering down soups, reusing ingredients that should have been thrown out days ago." Sylvia pulled out her notebook. "Are you willing to document this? Provide specific examples?" Linda's hands shook as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a flash drive. "I've been keeping records. Invoices, supplier contracts, meal cost breakdowns. I knew this was wrong, but I need this job. My kids. My ex-husband hasn't paid child support in 2 years, and this job pays better than anything else I can get without a college degree. Linda, this is incredibly brave. Is it?" Linda's laugh was bitter. "Because it feels like I'm about to destroy my life to maybe, possibly, help people who are too terrified to even admit they need help." Sylvia took the flash drive, feeling its weight in her palm. "What changed your mind?" "My grandmother." Linda's voice cracked slightly. "She died in a place like this 3 years ago. Not this facility, but similar. I swore I'd never let what happened to her happen to anyone else, but then Tyler came along with his cost-cutting and his threats, and I kept my head down and told myself I was protecting my kids. And now? Now I keep thinking about Mrs. Patterson from 2A. She's been asking why her meals don't taste right anymore, why she's been feeling sick after dinner. She reminds me so much of my grandmother." Linda wiped her eyes. "I can't keep pretending this is just about keeping my job." Sylvia reached across and squeezed Linda's hand. "You're doing the right thing." "Am I? Because Tyler's gonna know this information came from me. There are only 3 people with access to these records, and the other 2 are his cousins. My lawyer will make sure you're protected. There are whistleblower protections. Protections don't pay rent." Linda stood up, pacing to the window. "But I can't live with myself if someone gets seriously sick or dies because I was too cowardly to speak up." That evening, Sylvia called Ben from her room, her voice steady despite the weight of what she'd learned. "The residents are too frightened to testify," she reported. "Tyler's been systematically intimidating anyone who complains, using lease clauses and financial pressure to keep them quiet." "That's what I was afraid of, without resident testimony. But I have something better. Linda Stevens, the head of dining services. She's been documenting everything: financial records, supplier contracts, evidence of Tyler's embezzlement." She could hear Ben's sharp intake of breath. "She's willing to testify?" "She is. But Ben, she's taking an enormous risk. Tyler will know the leak came from her, and she's a single mother who can't afford to lose this job. I'll file for protection under Colorado's whistleblower statute as soon as I review her evidence. If Tyler retaliates against her, he'll be facing additional criminal charges." After hanging up, Sylvia sat in her chair by the window, looking out at Denver's evening lights. The case was taking shape, but she could feel Tyler's counterattack coming. He'd realized soon enough that his harmless prank had unleashed forces he couldn't control through intimidation and threats. The residents might be too frightened to stand with her publicly, but their fear itself had become evidence. Tyler's systematic campaign of intimidation was about to become his downfall. Tomorrow, she knew, the real battle would begin. Tyler had spent months building a system of fear and control, convinced that elderly residents were powerless to resist his abuse. He was about to learn just how wrong that assumption could be. Sylvia smiled grimly at her reflection in the window. Let him come. She'd spent 35 years taking down people who thought they were untouchable. Tyler Brennan was about to become just another violation she'd successfully prosecuted. The only difference was that this time, it was personal. Tyler's knock on Sylvia's door came at 7:30 the next morning. Aggressive, impatient, designed to intimidate. She opened it to find him flanked by two staff members, his face flushed with barely controlled rage. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past her into the room without invitation. "Good morning to you too, Tyler." Sylvia's voice remained level as she closed the door. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" "Cut the act, lady. I know what you're doing." He gestured at her desk where her notebook lay open. "Playing detective, trying to build some kind of case against me. It's pathetic." "I'm not sure what you mean." "Don't." Tyler's voice turned dangerous. "I know you've been talking to Linda, poisoning her mind with your conspiracy theories. I know you've been harassing other residents, trying to get them to lie about their care here." Sylvia studied his face, noting the flush of panic beneath the anger. "You seem upset, Tyler. Is there something specific you're concerned about?" "Here's what's going to happen." Tyler pulled out his phone, scrolling through screens. "I've been reviewing your file. Seems you've been having some concerning episodes lately. Confusion, paranoid delusions, aggressive behavior towards staff." "Have I?" "Memory problems too. Yesterday you couldn't remember what day it was when I asked. Very concerning for someone your age." His smile was cold, calculating. "I think it's time we discuss transitioning you to a facility better equipped to handle your declining cognitive function." The threat was clear, but Sylvia felt only a cold satisfaction. Tyler was making exactly the mistake she'd expected, overplaying his hand out of panic. "That's interesting," she said calmly, "because I don't recall having any conversation with you yesterday. In fact, I have a detailed log of all my interactions with facility staff. Would you like me to review it with you?" Tyler's confidence wavered slightly. "Look, I'm trying to help you here. These delusions you're having about food safety violations, about staff misconduct, it's clearly a sign of dementia onset. But if you keep causing problems, keep disturbing other residents with your fantasies, you'll what? I'll have to call your family. Your nephew Bobby, right? Lives in California, busy tech executive? I'm sure he'd be very concerned to hear about your deteriorating mental state. Might even think you need a conservatorship to protect you from making poor decisions." The mention of Bobby hit its mark, and Tyler saw it. His smile widened. "Bobby's a good guy, reasonable. He understands that family sometimes has to make hard choices for elderly relatives who can't take care of themselves anymore, especially when those relatives are causing problems, making wild accusations." Sylvia's hands remained steady, but her mind was racing. Tyler had clearly researched her family situation, knew exactly which pressure points to exploit. "Have you spoken to Bobby?" "Not yet. But I think it's time, don't you? Unless, of course, you decide to stop this nonsense. Stop bothering other residents, stop harassing my staff, and maybe we can all just move forward peacefully." Tyler stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because here's the thing, Sylvia, you're not in your old job anymore. You're not the inspector with the badge and the power. You're just another elderly resident in my facility, and I decide what's best for your care. I decide whether you're competent to make your own decisions. I decide whether your family needs to be concerned about your mental state. Is that a threat?" "It's reality." Tyler straightened, his confidence fully restored. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Drop whatever game you think you're playing, or I make some very concerning phone calls about your deteriorating condition." He headed for the door, then paused. "Oh, and Sylvia? Linda Stevens has been terminated. Effective immediately. Turns out she was stealing from the kitchen inventory. Very sad. Single mother, 2 kids. But theft is theft, right?" The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Sylvia sat heavily in her chair, Tyler's words echoing in her mind. He'd fired Linda. The one person brave enough to provide evidence was now gone, probably too terrified to testify after losing her job. But as the initial shock wore off, a different emotion took its place. Not fear, cold, focused rage. Tyler thought he held all the cards, thought he could manipulate family dynamics and institutional power to silence her. He'd just made his second critical mistake. The first was underestimating her professional competence. The second was threatening her family. Sylvia's hands moved with surgical precision as she dialed Ben's number, Tyler's threats still echoing in her mind. The morning light streaming through her window seemed harsher now, casting sharp shadows across her desk, where Linda's flash drive sat like a small beacon of hope. "Ben, we have a problem," she said without preamble when he answered. "Tyler's escalating. He fired Linda Stevens this morning and threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent." "Slow down. What exactly did he say?" As Sylvia recounted Tyler's visit, she could hear Ben's sharp intake of breath, the sound of rapid typing as he took notes. "This is actually good news," Ben said finally. "Good news? He fired our key witness and threatened to manipulate my family. He also just handed us evidence of witness intimidation and elder abuse. Sylvia, his desperation is showing. People who are confident in their position don't resort to these tactics." Ben's voice carried new energy. "We need to move fast, though. I'm going to contact Jennifer Mitchell at the Denver Post. She's been investigating elder care abuse. This could be exactly the story she's looking for." 2 hours later, Sylvia sat across from Jennifer Mitchell in a downtown coffee shop, studying the sharp-eyed journalist who'd agreed to meet on short notice. At 34, Jennifer possessed the kind of skeptical intelligence that reminded Sylvia of her younger self, someone who'd learned to look beneath surface appearances. "So let me understand this correctly," Jennifer said, her recorder sitting between them on the small table. "The operations manager of an upscale assisted living facility served residents dog food, filmed their reactions, then threatened to have you declared mentally incompetent when you complained. That's the simplified version, yes." Jennifer's expression remained carefully neutral. "Ms. Williams, I have to ask, and please don't take offense, but how do I know this isn't a case of misunderstanding? Sometimes institutional food can be unpalatable, and residents might interpret. Would you like to see the evidence?" Sylvia opened her folder with practiced efficiency. Temperature logs showing unsafe food storage, photographs of expired ingredients, financial records indicating meal budget cuts of 60%. Jennifer's skepticism evaporated as she reviewed the documentation. "This is incredibly thorough. You documented all of this yourself? 35 years as a food safety inspector teaches you to be methodical." Sylvia watched Jennifer's expression change from polite interest to genuine concern. "Tyler Brennan made a critical error. He assumed I was just another elderly resident he could intimidate into silence. And Linda Stevens? She was your inside source? Until Tyler fired her this morning for theft. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" Jennifer looked up from the documents. "Have you contacted the health department? The state licensing board?" "My lawyer is handling official complaints. But Tyler's shown he's willing to retaliate against anyone who challenges him. The residents are terrified, staff members are afraid for their jobs, and he's using financial vulnerability as a weapon to maintain control. What do you want from me?" Sylvia leaned forward slightly. "I want people to know that this is happening, not just at Sunset Manor, but at facilities across the state. Elder abuse thrives in darkness, Mr. Mitchell. Shine some light on it." That afternoon, Sylvia made another call. This one to Dr. Catherine Anderson, her former colleague at the Colorado Department of Health. "Kate? It's Sylvia Williams. I need a favor." "Sylvia, how are you enjoying retirement?" Kate's voice carried genuine warmth. "Please tell me you're not calling about some restaurant you think I should inspect." "Not exactly." Sylvia explained the situation, hearing Kate's professional interest sharpen as she described the violations. "You documented temperature readings? Photographed expired products?" Kate's voice carried new respect. "Sylvia, some of these violations could result in serious illness or death, especially among elderly residents with compromised immune systems. Would you be willing to review my evidence? Provide expert testimony if needed? Send me everything. If what you're describing is accurate, this facility should be shut down immediately." Kate paused. "Sylvia, I have to ask, are you sure about this? Taking on institutional abuse at your age, dealing with the stress of litigation. Kate, they served us dog food and filmed our humiliation for entertainment. Then they threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent when I complained. I'm not backing down from this fight." "Good. Because if even half of what you've told me is true, Tyler Brennan needs to face serious consequences." That evening, Jennifer Mitchell called with news that made Sylvia's pulse quicken. I've been making calls all afternoon, Jennifer said. Sunset Manor isn't the only facility with problems. I've found 3 other assisted living centers in the Denver area with similar complaints. Cost-cutting measures, intimidation of residents, financial irregularities. Similar to what Tyler's doing? Disturbingly similar. It's looking like a pattern across multiple facilities, possibly connected to the same management company or investment group. Jennifer's voice carried the excitement of a journalist sensing a bigger story. Sylvia, would you be willing to go on record? Full interview, your name and photo in the paper? Sylvia thought of Tyler's threats, of Bobby's potential reaction, of the comfortable anonymity she'd be giving up. Yes, she said without hesitation. There's something else. I reached out to Linda Stevens. She's willing to talk, but she's scared. She's got 2 kids, no job, and Tyler's already started spreading rumors about her theft to other potential employers. Can you protect her? I can keep her name out of the initial story, use her as a confidential source. But eventually, if this goes to trial, she'll have to testify publicly. She knows the risks. She's braver than she thinks. The next morning, Tyler's phone call to Bobby came exactly as promised. Sylvia listened to her nephew's concerned voice on the phone, his words carefully chosen but clearly influenced by Tyler's professional opinion. Aunt Sylvia, I got a very concerning call from the facility manager. He says you've been having some episodes, making accusations about the staff. Bobby, Sylvia interrupted gently, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. 20 minutes later, Bobby's tone had changed completely. Jesus Christ, Aunt Sylvia. He actually served you dog food? And filmed it? Among other things. Bobby, Tyler was counting on you dismissing my concerns as confusion or dementia. He's been using family dynamics to silence elderly residents who complain about abuse. What do you need from me? Nothing. Just believe me when I tell you that I'm not confused, I'm not paranoid, and I'm certainly not backing down from this fight. Good. Because if this bastard thinks he can manipulate our family to cover up elder abuse, he's about to learn otherwise. As Sylvia hung up the phone, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the satisfaction of a plan coming together. Tyler had tried to use her family against her, tried to paint her as a confused old woman whose complaints should be dismissed. Instead, he'd just gained another enemy. And Bobby, with his tech executive resources and connections, was not the kind of enemy Tyler could intimidate or manipulate. The war was escalating, but for the first time since the dog food incident, Sylvia felt like she wasn't fighting alone. The light Jennifer Mitchell would shine on Sunset Manor's practices would expose Tyler's abuse to public scrutiny. Let him try to spin dog food and financial fraud as the delusions of a confused elderly woman. The truth, Sylvia had learned over 35 years of inspections, had a way of making itself known. And Tyler Brennan was about to discover just how bright that light could shine. The conference room at Hartwell & Associates felt smaller than usual with the presence of Tyler's legal team. 3 attorneys from Morrison, Blake & Associates, the kind of downtown firm that charged by the minute and intimidated by reputation. Sylvia sat beside Ben, her evidence folder neat and organized, watching Tyler fidget in his expensive suit across the mahogany table. My clients are prepared to offer a reasonable settlement, announced Patricia Morrison, the lead attorney whose silver hair and tailored jacket spoke of decades battling in Denver's courtrooms. $50,000, with a standard confidentiality agreement. Ms. Williams can relocate to a facility of her choosing, and we can all move forward without the expense and uncertainty of litigation. Ben glanced at Sylvia, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. My client has been clear from the beginning, Ben replied. No settlements, no confidentiality agreements. This case goes to trial. Tyler leaned forward, his voice carrying forced reasonableness. Ms. Williams, I understand you felt humiliated by our admittedly poor judgment taste test, but destroying careers over a simple mistake seems excessive, don't you think? Sylvia studied his face, the calculated sincerity, the subtle condescension that suggested she should be grateful for his attention. It was the same expression he'd worn while filming residents eating dog food. Mr. Brennan, she said quietly, Serving elderly residents dog food while filming their humiliation isn't a mistake, it's abuse. And the financial fraud I've documented isn't poor judgment, it's theft. Patricia Morrison's expression sharpened. Ms. Williams, these are serious allegations. I hope you understand that false accusations can result in defamation charges. I hope you understand that documented evidence can result in criminal charges. Sylvia opened her folder with practiced efficiency. Would you like to review the temperature logs showing consistent food safety violations? The photographs of expired products being served to residents? The financial records showing meal budget cuts while resident fees remained constant? The room fell silent as Tyler's attorneys reviewed the evidence. Sylvia watched their confident expressions gradually shift to concern, then to barely concealed alarm. Where did you obtain these financial records? Patricia asked carefully. From a whistleblower who documented systematic violations and financial irregularities. Ben's voice carried quiet satisfaction. A whistleblower who was subsequently fired in retaliation, which constitutes additional criminal behavior under Colorado law. Tyler's face flushed. Linda Stevens was terminated for theft. We have documentation. You have fabricated documentation created after she provided evidence of your misconduct. Ben slid a folder across the table. These are Linda's actual employment records, including commendations for honesty and dedication. The theft charges weren't filed until the day after she became a witness in this case. The deposition phase began 2 weeks later. Sylvia found herself in the same conference room, this time facing Tyler's new attorney. Patricia Morrison had mysteriously developed a scheduling conflict and passed the case to a junior associate. Ms. Williams, the young lawyer began, his nervousness showing despite his attempt at professional composure. You claim to have professional expertise in food safety, but isn't it true that you've been retired for 3 years? Yes. And isn't it true that food safety regulations have changed significantly during that time? Sylvia's smile was patient, almost grandmotherly. Could you be more specific about which regulations you believe have changed? The attorney shuffled through his notes. Well, temperature requirements for food storage have remained consistent for over a decade. Cold storage at 38 degrees or below, hot holding at 140 degrees or above. Sylvia's voice carried the calm authority of decades of experience. These aren't recent innovations, counselor. They're fundamental food safety principles. But surely your memory of specific regulations might be less reliable than it once was? Ben intervened smoothly. Objection. Are you questioning the witness's mental competency? I'm simply suggesting that age can affect recall accuracy. Sylvia leaned forward slightly. Would you like me to recite the Colorado Food Code sections regarding institutional food service? I can quote them verbatim, along with the federal regulations they're based on. Or perhaps you'd prefer I walk you through the inspection protocols I developed that are still being used by the state health department. The attorney's confidence visibly deflated. That won't be necessary. The session continued for 3 hours, with Tyler's legal team attempting to portray Sylvia as a vindictive resident with failing mental faculties. Each attack only served to demonstrate her sharp memory, professional expertise, and methodical approach to documentation. Linda Stevens' deposition the following day proved equally devastating to Tyler's defense. Miss Stevens, Ben began gently, can you describe the working conditions at Sunset Manor under Mr. Brennan's management? Linda's voice was steady, despite her obvious nervousness. The meal budget was cut by 60% in Tyler's first 6 months. We were instructed to purchase expired meat from discount suppliers, water down soups to stretch portions, and reuse ingredients that should have been discarded. Did you express concerns about these practices? Multiple times. Tyler said the residents wouldn't notice the difference, and if they complained, we should tell them the recipes were being, quote, updated for better nutrition. What happened when you documented these practices? I was told to stop keeping records, that it was making the other staff nervous. When I continued documenting violations, Tyler began making comments about my job performance, suggesting I might not be a good fit for the position. Tyler's attorney attempted damage control. Ms. Stevens, isn't it true that you were terminated for theft? I was terminated the day after I provided evidence to Ms. Williams' attorney. The theft charges weren't filed until after my termination, and they consist entirely of documentation created after I was already fired. Linda's voice strengthened. I kept copies of everything, including the timestamps on the supposedly stolen inventory reports. Dr. Catherine Anderson's expert testimony provided the final nail in Tyler's defense. Based on my review of Ms. Williams' documentation, Kate testified, Sunset Manor was operating in violation of at least 15 separate food safety regulations. The temperature violations alone could result in serious foodborne illness, particularly dangerous for elderly residents with compromised immune systems. In your professional opinion, what would be the appropriate regulatory response to these violations? Immediate facility closure pending correction of all violations, criminal charges for endangering vulnerable populations, and financial penalties significant enough to deter similar behavior. After Kate's testimony, Tyler's remaining attorney requested a brief recess. When they returned, his surrender was complete. My client is prepared to discuss settlement terms, he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought we'd established there would be no settlement, Ben replied. Sylvia watched Tyler's face across the table. The arrogance replaced by desperation, the cruel confidence transformed into barely controlled panic. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his exposed cruelty. Actually, she said quietly, I think it's time we discussed terms, but not the kind of settlement Mr. Brennan has in mind. She opened her folder one final time, pulling out a document that made Tyler's face go white. These are criminal referrals to the district attorney's office, the state health department, and the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies. Mr. Brennan, you're not just losing a civil case. You're facing criminal charges for elder abuse, financial fraud, and witness intimidation. The room fell silent, except for Tyler's sharp intake of breath. The only settlement I'm interested in, Sylvia continued, is one that ensures you never have the opportunity to abuse elderly residents again, and that other facilities understand there are real consequences for treating vulnerable people as entertainment. Tyler's attorney leaned over to whisper urgently in his client's ear, but Tyler seemed to have stopped listening. He was staring at Sylvia with something approaching recognition, finally understanding that he hadn't been fighting a confused elderly woman, but a professional who'd spent 35 years taking down people exactly like him. The depositions were over, but the real battle was just beginning. And for the first time since this nightmare started, Tyler Brennan was beginning to understand just how thoroughly he'd underestimated his opponent. Bobby Williams stood in the doorway of Sylvia's room at Sunset Manor, his expensive business casual clothes and carefully styled hair making him look oddly out of place among the facility's muted pastels and generic furniture. 3 months had passed since their last conversation, when Tyler's manipulation had nearly worked, and the guilt was written plainly across his nephew's face. Aunt Sylvia, I owe you an apology, he said, setting down his overnight bag with the careful movements of someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. Sylvia looked up from her legal documents, noting the exhaustion in Bobby's eyes, the way his usual tech executive confidence had been replaced by something more vulnerable. You came. I should have come months ago. Bobby settled into the chair across from her small sitting area, his hands clasped tightly together. When Tyler called me, when he suggested you were having episodes, I wanted to believe him because it would have been easier than admitting I'd dumped you here and forgotten about you. You didn't dump me anywhere. I chose this place. Did you? Or did I pressure you into it because dealing with your heart attack from 3,000 miles away was too complicated for my schedule? Bobby's voice carried a bitterness that seemed directed entirely at himself. I sent monthly checks and told myself that was enough, that you were safe and happy and I could go back to my important meetings and product launches. Sylvia set down her papers, studying her nephew's face. At 41, Bobby had built a successful career in Silicon Valley, but sitting in her assisted living room, he looked like the uncertain boy she'd helped with homework when her sister was working double shifts. Bobby, you're not responsible for Tyler's behavior. Aren't I? When he called me, told me you were making accusations about staff, having paranoid episodes about food safety violations, my first instinct was to believe him over you, my own aunt. Bobby's laugh was hollow. I actually asked him if we should look into memory care facilities. Jesus, Sylvia! I was ready to have you declared incompetent based on the word of a man I'd never met. A knock on the door interrupted them. Tyler Brennan stood in the hallway, his usual arrogant demeanor replaced by something that might have been desperation. His expensive suit couldn't hide the stress lines around his eyes or the way his hands trembled slightly. Ms. Williams, I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to speak with you and your nephew about resolving this misunderstanding. Bobby stood slowly, and Sylvia watched her nephew's expression transform from guilt to cold anger as he took in Tyler's appearance, the man who'd tried to manipulate their family relationship to cover up elder abuse. You're Tyler Brennan, Bobby said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to commanding boardrooms. Yes, I'm the operations manager here. I believe we spoke on the phone a few months ago about your aunt's concerning behavior. We did. Bobby stepped closer to Tyler, who seemed to shrink slightly under the younger man's gaze. You told me my aunt was having paranoid delusions about food safety. You suggested she might need psychiatric evaluation. Well, elderly residents sometimes become confused about routine procedures. Routine procedures? Bobby's voice remained dangerously quiet. Is serving dog food to elderly residents a routine procedure, Mr. Brennan? Tyler's face flushed. That was a poorly conceived taste test that got out of hand. A mistake in judgment, nothing more. And the financial fraud? The expired food being served to residents? The intimidation of witnesses? Bobby pulled out his phone, showing Tyler the screen. Because I've been reading the depositions, Mr. Brennan. Every single page. I don't know what lies your aunt has been telling you. My aunt didn't tell me anything. Bobby's tone could have frozen helium. I hired my own investigator. Funny thing about tech executives, we understand data analysis. And the data shows a pattern of systematic abuse, financial theft, and elder mistreatment that started the day you took over operations here. Tyler took a step back, clearly not expecting this level of opposition from Bobby. Look, we can work something out. Your aunt is obviously upset about the taste test incident, but there's no need to destroy careers over a simple misunderstanding. A simple misunderstanding? Bobby turned to Sylvia, his voice softening. Aunt Sylvia, would you mind if I handled this? Sylvia settled back in her chair, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Please do. Bobby turned back to Tyler, his corporate executive persona fully engaged. Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Brennan. You're going to walk out of this room, pack your office, and resign effective immediately. You're going to cooperate fully with all criminal investigations. And you're going to stay far away from my aunt and every other resident in this facility. You can't threaten me. I have rights. Do you? Because according to my investigator, you're also being investigated for embezzlement from 2 other facilities you managed in the past 5 years. Funny how these patterns follow people around. Bobby's smile was sharp as a blade. I also had my legal team review your employment contract. Turns out, criminal behavior is grounds for immediate termination without severance. Tyler's confidence crumbled visibly. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Marcus Thompson, the owner. He demands profit margins that are impossible to meet while maintaining quality care. The dog food thing was stupid, I admit that. But the cost-cutting measures were necessary to keep this place profitable. So you threw elderly residents under the bus to protect your profit margins? Bobby's voice carried genuine disgust. You served them expired food, cut their meal budgets by 60%, and humiliated them for entertainment rather than finding legitimate ways to manage costs? It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. Bobby pulled out his phone again. Marcus Thompson is downstairs right now, by the way. I called him this morning, explained the legal liability he's facing by keeping you employed. Turns out, he's very interested in protecting his investment. As if summoned by Bobby's words, Marcus Thompson appeared in the doorway, a heavy-set man in his 50s whose expensive clothes couldn't hide his obvious discomfort. Tyler's uncle looked like a man who'd just realized his family loyalty might cost him his business empire. Tyler, Marcus said quietly, we need to talk. Uncle Marcus, I can explain. No. Marcus's voice was flat, final. You can't. I've been reviewing the legal documents, the evidence, the potential liability. You're fired, Effective immediately. Security is waiting to escort you out. Tyler looked between his uncle and Bobby, perhaps finally understanding that his network of protection had evaporated. You can't do this to me. I'm family. Family doesn't serve dog food to elderly people for entertainment, Marcus replied. Family doesn't embezzle from facilities caring for vulnerable residents. You did this to yourself, Tyler. As Tyler was escorted from the building by security, Bobby turned back to Sylvia, his expression a mixture of pride and lingering guilt. I should have believed you from the beginning, he said. You believe me now. That's what matters. Bobby sat down heavily, running his hands through his hair. I've been thinking about something you said once. When I was a kid, you told me that family isn't just about blood. It's about showing up when people need you most. I remember. I didn't show up, Aunt Sylvia. I sent checks and made phone calls and told myself that was enough. But when you needed someone to believe you, to stand up for you, I wasn't there. Sylvia reached across and took his hand, noting how much older it looked than she remembered. You're here now. I want to do more than just be here. I want to help, whatever you need for this case, whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't happen to other people. Are you sure? This case is going to be very public. Your name will be associated with elder abuse litigation. Bobby's smile was the first genuine one she'd seen from him all day. Good. Maybe it'll encourage other families to pay attention to how their elderly relatives are actually being treated. That evening, as Bobby reviewed case documents and made calls to his own legal team, Sylvia felt something she hadn't experienced in years: the comfort of family support. Not the distant, dutiful care of monthly checks and holiday phone calls, but the active, engaged presence of someone who genuinely cared about her well-being. Tyler was gone, but his systematic abuse had been enabled by families like theirs. Well-meaning relatives who'd assumed that expensive facilities meant quality care, who'd trusted institutions to protect their loved ones without oversight. Bobby, she said as he closed his laptop for the evening, when this is over, I want to start a foundation. Something to help families monitor elder care facilities, to provide resources for residents who want to report abuse. I'll help you build it, he replied without hesitation. We'll make sure Tyler Brennan was just the beginning, not the end. For the first time since moving to Sunset Manor, Sylvia felt truly at home, not because of the facility, that would change soon enough, but because she'd found her way back to the family connection she'd thought was lost. The break-in at Sunset Manor's administrative offices occurred at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, according to the security footage that Bobby's private investigator would later analyze frame by frame. Tyler Brennan, desperate and increasingly unhinged, had used his knowledge of the facility's security systems to slip past cameras and access the filing cabinets where financial records were stored. What he hadn't counted on was Linda Stevens' foresight. The former dining services manager had anticipated exactly this scenario when she'd first provided evidence to Sylvia, making multiple copies of every document and storing them in locations Tyler couldn't access or destroy. Sylvia learned about the break-in from Ben's urgent phone call at dawn. Tyler's lost it completely, Ben said, his voice tight with anger. He broke into the facility offices, destroyed hard drives, shredded financial documents. Marcus Thompson is beside himself. This is going to look terrible in court. What about Linda's evidence? Safe. But Sylvia, this isn't just about document destruction. Tyler left behind a manifesto of sorts, printed emails detailing what he calls the conspiracy against him. He's naming you, me, Bobby, Linda, even some of the residents as participants in an elaborate scheme to destroy his career. Sylvia felt a chill of recognition. She'd seen this pattern before in her inspection career. Desperate restaurant owners who, facing closure, would lash out at health inspectors, claiming persecution and conspiracy, rather than accepting responsibility for their violations. Is he dangerous? I don't know. But I'm recommending you stay somewhere else until we can assess the situation. By afternoon, Tyler's desperation had taken an even more disturbing turn. Jennifer Mitchell called with news that made Sylvia's blood run cold. He's been contacting news outlets, Jennifer reported. Local TV stations, online blogs, anyone who'll listen. He's claiming you're part of an elaborate insurance fraud scheme. That you deliberately moved into Sunset Manor to manufacture a lawsuit. That's ridiculous. Of course it is. But Tyler's spinning an increasingly elaborate conspiracy theory. He's claiming you and Bobby planned this from the beginning, that your heart attack was faked to justify the move to assisted living, that Linda Stevens was your inside accomplice planted months in advance. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if not for the dangerous desperation behind it. Tyler was constructing an alternate reality where he was the victim, where his systematic abuse of elderly residents was somehow justified as defense against an elaborate con game. Are any news outlets taking him seriously? The legitimate ones aren't. But there are a few blog sites and social media accounts starting to pick up his story. He's positioned himself as the whistleblower exposing eldercare fraud, painting you as a professional grifter who targets facilities for lawsuits. That evening, Bobby arrived at Sylvia's temporary hotel room with Marcus Thompson in tow. The facility owner looked haggard, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his usual business confidence replaced by barely controlled panic. "Ms. Williams," Marcus began, his voice shaking slightly, "I need you to understand. I had no idea what Tyler was doing. The financial irregularities, the cost-cutting measures, the dog food incident. I trusted him to manage operations while I focused on expansion." "Ignorance isn't a legal defense, Mr. Thompson," Bobby replied coldly. What about his mental state claims? His behavior is certainly erratic, but there's clear evidence of calculated criminal activity over an extended period. The conspiracy theories appear to be a desperate attempt to justify his behavior rather than genuine delusion. That evening, as Sylvia reviewed the final pieces of Tyler's dramatic collapse, she felt an unexpected sadness alongside her satisfaction. Tyler had been cruel, abusive, and criminal in his treatment of vulnerable elderly residents. But his complete psychological breakdown revealed someone who'd been in over his head from the beginning, making increasingly desperate choices to cover up his incompetence until the lies became their own reality. "He could have just done his job properly," she said to Bobby as they reviewed the day's developments. "If he'd actually cared about the residents, managed the budget responsibly, treated people with basic dignity, none of this would have happened. Instead, he chose to see elderly residents as targets rather than human beings," Bobby replied. "That's not incompetence, Aunt Sylvia. That's a fundamental failure of character." Tyler's final gambit had been to rewrite history, to cast himself as the victim of an elaborate conspiracy rather than face the consequences of his actions. But documentation, witness testimony, and his own increasingly desperate behavior had created an unshakable record of systematic abuse and criminal conduct. As Sylvia prepared for bed in her hotel room, she thought about Tyler sitting in a jail cell, probably still constructing elaborate theories about the conspiracy that had destroyed his career. The truth was much simpler. He'd been brought down by one elderly woman who refused to be silently victimized, who'd used her professional expertise and personal determination to hold him accountable for his cruelty. Tyler Brennan's final gambit had been desperation disguised as defiance. It had failed as spectacularly as everything else he'd attempted since that night. He'd served dog food to vulnerable elderly residents for his entertainment. The only question now was whether his downfall would serve as a warning to others who might see elder abuse as a crime without consequences. 6 months after Tyler Brennan's arrest, Sylvia Williams stood at the podium in the Colorado State Capitol building, addressing a packed auditorium of legislators, elder care advocates, and family members whose own stories of institutional abuse had emerged in the wake of her case. The settlement with Sunset Manor had been substantial. Not just the financial compensation, but the systemic changes that would ripple through Colorado's eldercare industry. When Tyler Brennan served dog food to elderly residents and filmed our humiliation for entertainment, Sylvia began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, he made a critical miscalculation. He assumed that age meant powerlessness, that retirement meant defeat, that elderly voices could be safely ignored. In the front row sat Linda Stevens, now the successful manager of Sunset Manor's completely reformed operations, her teenage children beside her with expressions of obvious pride. Behind them, Bobby Williams worked quietly on his laptop, managing the Williams Foundation for Elder Rights, the organization that had grown from their hotel room conversation into a statewide advocacy network. Tyler thought he was dealing with helpless victims, Sylvia continued. What he actually encountered was a woman who'd spent 35 years documenting violations and holding people accountable for endangering vulnerable populations. The skills don't disappear when you retire. They just find new applications. Jennifer Mitchell sat in the press section, her investigative series on Colorado eldercare abuse having won a Pulitzer nomination and prompted legislative hearings across 3 states. Her initial story about Sunset Manor had uncovered a network of cost-cutting schemes and resident abuse that reached far beyond Tyler's individual cruelty. The Tyler Brennan case taught us that elder abuse thrives in isolation, Sylvia said, her eyes scanning the audience. It feeds on the assumption that elderly complaints are just confusion, that family members are too busy to investigate, that professional credentials don't matter once you move to assisted living. Dr. Catherine Anderson sat with a group of state health inspectors, her expert testimony in the criminal trial having led to new protocols for investigating elder care facilities. Tyler's conviction on all counts had sent a clear message through the industry. Abuse of elderly residents would face serious consequences. But this case also taught us something more important. Sylvia's voice strengthened. It showed us that one person's refusal to be silently victimized can create change that extends far beyond their individual situation. She looked toward the back of the room where Marcus Thompson sat uncomfortably but attentively. His facilities had become models for transparent management and resident advocacy, after implementing reforms that went far beyond legal requirements. The transformation hadn't been altruistic. The liability exposure from Tyler's crimes had been staggering, but the results were real. Tyler Brennan is currently serving a 4-year sentence for elder abuse, financial fraud, and witness intimidation, Sylvia continued. But punishment alone doesn't prevent future abuse. What prevents abuse is vigilance, advocacy, and the understanding that dignity doesn't diminish with age. In the legislative gallery, Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Costa sat with other Sunset Manor residents who'd found their voices after Tyler's removal. Their testimony during the criminal trial had been powerful, not just because of what they'd endured, but because of their courage in speaking publicly about institutional mistreatment. The legislation being considered today, the Elder Care Transparency Act, would require facilities to provide families with real-time access to meal budgets, staffing levels, and inspection reports, Sylvia explained. It would establish resident advocate positions and create legal protections for elderly residents who report abuse. Ben Hartwell sat with the legal team that had worked pro bono on related cases emerging from the investigation. The Brennan case had established precedents that made elder abuse litigation more viable, encouraging other victims to come forward with their own stories of institutional mistreatment. But legislation alone isn't enough, Sylvia said, her tone becoming more personal. What we really need is for families to stay engaged, for communities to pay attention, and for society to understand that moving someone to assisted living doesn't mean abandoning responsibility for their well-being. She paused, looking at Bobby, whose transformation from distant nephew to engaged advocate had been as dramatic as any aspect of the case. My nephew learned this lesson painfully. He thought monthly checks and holiday phone calls were sufficient care. Tyler Brennan's manipulation almost worked because family members often want to believe that expensive facilities mean quality care, that professional staff means professional treatment. Bobby nodded, his expression serious. The Williams Foundation had processed over 300 reports of suspected elder abuse in its first 6 months, providing resources and advocacy for families navigating complex institutional systems. The real victory in this case wasn't the settlement money or even Tyler's conviction, Sylvia continued. It was the discovery that elderly voices still carry power when they're heard, that professional expertise doesn't expire with retirement, and that dignity is not negotiable regardless of age or living situation. As she concluded her remarks, the standing ovation was immediate and sustained. But Sylvia's attention was drawn to a small section of the audience, elderly residents from facilities across Colorado, who'd driven or been driven to hear her speak. Their faces showed something she recognized from her own experience: the transition from helpless victim to empowered advocate. After the hearing, Sylvia found herself surrounded by reporters, advocates, and family members, wanting to share their own stories. But the conversation that mattered most came from an unexpected source. Ms. Williams? The voice belonged to a young man in his 20s, nervously approaching with a small recording device. I'm David Martinez from the University of Denver Journalism Program. I'm working on a story about institutional accountability. What can I help you with? I wanted to ask about forgiveness, David said carefully. Tyler Brennan's family has been saying he was overwhelmed, that he made mistakes under pressure. Do you think there's a place for forgiveness in cases like this? Sylvia considered the question seriously. David, Tyler didn't make mistakes. He made choices. He chose to see elderly residents as objects for his entertainment rather than human beings deserving respect. He chose to steal from meal budgets rather than find legitimate cost savings. He chose to intimidate witnesses rather than accept responsibility for his actions. But don't you think people can change? I hope they can. But change has to start with acknowledging harm done, not constructing conspiracy theories to avoid responsibility. Sylvia's voice remained gentle but firm. Tyler spent his final weeks as a free man trying to destroy evidence and intimidate the people he'd victimized. That's not someone seeking redemption. That's someone who still doesn't understand what he did wrong. That evening, Sylvia sat in her new apartment, a senior-friendly complex that prioritized resident independence and community engagement over institutional convenience. The view from her window showed downtown Denver's lights, but her attention was focused on the laptop where she was reviewing applications for the Foundation's new grant program. Bobby knocked on her door at 8 o'clock, carrying Chinese takeout and a stack of legal documents. How did it feel? He asked, as they settled in her small dining area. Standing up there, addressing the legislature about Tyler's crimes? Satisfying, Sylvia admitted, but also sobering. For every Tyler Brennan who gets caught and prosecuted, how many others are out there treating elderly residents as inconveniences to be managed, rather than people to be respected? That's why we're building the foundation. That's why you keep speaking at these hearings. Bobby's voice carried the conviction of someone who'd found his purpose. One case at a time, one facility at a time, one family at a time. Sylvia smiled, thinking about the journey from that humiliating night when Tyler had served dog food to residents for his entertainment to this evening when she was helping shape legislation that would protect vulnerable elderly people across Colorado. You know what the real last laugh is? She said, opening one of the takeout containers. What? Tyler thought he was punishing us with that dog food prank. He thought he was demonstrating his power over helpless old people. Sylvia's smile was sharp, but not unkind. Instead, he created the catalyst for his own downfall, and sparked a movement that's already prevented abuse at dozens of facilities. Poetic justice? More than that. Tyler's cruelty became the foundation for lasting change. His moment of entertainment became the evidence that convicted him. His assumption about powerless elderly victims became the source of his own powerlessness. As they shared dinner and reviewed Foundation business, Sylvia felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal vindication. Tyler Brennan's abuse had been exposed, prosecuted, and punished. But more importantly, his downfall had created systems and precedents that would protect other elderly residents from similar treatment. The dog food incident that was meant to humiliate vulnerable elderly people had instead become a symbol of resistance, proof that dignity doesn't diminish with age, and that accountability doesn't end when victims are elderly. Tyler Brennan had gotten his laugh that night in the dining room, filming confused and humiliated residents eating food meant for animals. But Sylvia Williams had gotten the last laugh, the one that mattered, the one that created change, the one that proved elderly voices still carried power when they refused to be silenced. In his prison cell, Tyler was probably still constructing conspiracy theories about the network of people who'd destroyed his career. He'd never understand that his downfall had been orchestrated by one elderly woman who'd simply refused to accept that abuse was the price of growing old. Sometimes the best revenge was justice. And sometimes justice came with a smile that Tyler Brennan would never see but would spend years trying to understand. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,